Hello, this is Duck Recapped here. Welcome back to another video. In the opening scene, we are shown a pregnant woman who is urgently taken to the hospital during a rainstorm to give birth. Later, the doctor informs her husband, Greg, that she tragically passed away during childbirth. He also reveals that their baby has albinism, a genetic condition causing lack of pigmentation. Greg is then taken to see the baby, who is undergoing a brainwave test. Unfortunately, upon seeing the pale baby, he becomes so overwhelmed with grief that he rejects the child as his own. The story then cuts to 2 decades later, where Sheriff Doug and his team are investigating the recent death of an elderly man at a farmhouse. They determine that the man died from a heart attack. During their search of the house, they stumble upon an underground basement where they find a boy in hiding. Despite their efforts to coax him out, he refuses. Suspecting that he is scared, Doug calls upon a child services psychologist named Jessie Caldwell for assistance. She arrives shortly after and immediately heads to the basement, where she finds the boy hiding in a dark corner. Through Jessie's encouragement, the boy eventually comes out into the light, revealing his luminously white skin. His actual name is Jeremy Reed, but he is nicknamed Powder due to his bright skin tone. It is revealed that Powder has never stepped outside the house. After a while, Jessie asks Powder why he didn't contact the police when his grandfather passed away. In response, the poor boy explains that his grandfather warned him that he could be taken away if anyone saw him. So, he always stayed away from other people. For education, he has built up a small library and memorized all the books there. Powder claims that he can recite each and every paragraph of all the books he owns. Hearing this, Jessie picks a challenging book, typically intended for college students, and asks him to recite a specific page number. To her amazement, Powder recites the first paragraph of that page without any errors. Afterward, Powder accompanies Jessie out of the basement, and she takes him to a boys' hostel, because he is now under the care of the state. Upon their arrival, the other boys are captivated by Powder's appearance, as they have never seen someone like him before. Later that night, while Powder is having dinner at the hostel, a gang of bullies approaches him. The leader, John, demands that Powder wear a spoon on his nose. In a surprising turn of events, Powder takes the spoon from John's hand and begins to manipulate it. He makes it stand upright on the table and effortlessly draws other spoons towards it. This astonishes all the boys present there, and they assume that Powder is some kind of freak. On the other hand, Doug returns home after work and finds his son, Steve, at the door. Their strained relationship is evident as they pass each other without exchanging a single word. It appears that Steve came to check on his ailing mother, Emma, who is confined to her bed due to cancer. The caretaker informs Doug that seeing their son has brought Emma a sense of healing far beyond what any painkillers could provide. A few days later, Powder enrolls in a high school and attends a physics class. During the class, Professor Ripley demonstrates an apparatus called Jacob's ladder, which generates an electric current. As the machine is turned on, Powder starts feeling uneasy and begins to shake. Suddenly, the machine overloads and discharges a powerful bolt of electricity directly into Powder's chest. This causes him to levitate in the air, horrifying all the students present in the class. Donnelly frantically tries to switch the machine off, but to no avail. So, he destroys it with a chair, finally bringing an end to the chaos. In the aftermath, all the students rush out of the classroom while Powder lies unconscious on the floor. Worried that he has passed away, Donald approaches him and touches his body. Surprisingly, the professor experiences an odd sensation which raises his arm's hair and plunges him into a kind of altered state. In the next scene, Powder is hurriedly taken to the hospital, where Donald describes the incident to the doctor. However, the latter doesn't believe it, as a strong electrical shock like that would have typically killed the boy, or at least left some burn marks. Donald tries to convince the doctor by explaining that Powder's body constantly undergoes a process called electrolysis, which is the reason why he lacks body hair. As the two continue discussing, a nurse interrupts them and reveals that Powder has escaped from the hospital. Apparently, he jumped through the window when no one was around. Meanwhile, Powder is walking along the streets when he comes across one of his classmates, Lindsay. They engage in a brief conversation while being observed by a curious neighbor. Powder looks back at the neighbor and informs Lindsay that he can hear their inner thoughts. However, she believes that he is simply hallucinating due to the electric shock. Following this, Powder continues his journey back to his grandparents' house. However, he is eventually captured by Doug and his co-worker, Duncan, who ask him to get inside the car. Returning to the school, Powder is led to a conference room to discuss his exceptional intellect. The principal visits him personally and reveals that his IQ test results have come out. It turns out Powder's IQ is over 300, which is far more than that of the most intelligent person in the world. The principal announces that he is a unique and extraordinary individual. However, Powder shows no interest in such matters and simply requests to be allowed to return home. Unfortunately for him, Jesse reveals that he can no longer go back home since the house now belongs to the bank. In the next scene, the high school students, accompanied by Doug and Duncan, embark on a camping trip in the woods. That evening, while the students gather around a bonfire, Powder sits by himself. Seeing this, Doug approaches him and the two begin talking. At the same time, a thunderstorm begins, and Powder mentions that he can sense the storm within himself. He expresses that when he sees lightning, he feels a magnetic pull towards it. Powder recalls his grandmother telling him it's God, although he doesn't believe it. He also reveals that his mother was struck by lightning while pregnant with him, which appears to be the reason for his special condition. The next morning, as Powder is wandering in the woods, he is approached by the bullies, John and Mitch. Without any reason, John points his gun at Powder, saying that he can kill him right away. However, before he can pull the trigger, a gunshot is heard in the distance, diverting everyone's attention. They rush in the direction and discover that Duncan has shot a deer. Powder is deeply affected by the sight, as he can empathetically sense the pain and fear of the dying deer. When he cannot take it anymore, he grabs Duncan's wrist with one of his hands while the deer's neck. Surprisingly, Powder transfers the deer's sensations of pain and fear to Duncan, causing the latter to convulse violently. As the effect intensifies, John aims his gun at Powder, demanding that he release the officer. However, our protagonist simply stares him in the eye and continues torturing Duncan. Enraged, John pulls the trigger, but Mitch intervenes in the nick of time, raising the gun and ultimately saving Powder's life. In the aftermath of these events, Powder is brought back to Jesse, who questions him about what transpired. She is genuinely worried about his well-being and state of mind. However, Powder ignores all her questions and states that he wants to return home. When she keeps on insisting, he becomes angry and unintentionally unleashes his powers, causing glasses as well as the lights to shatter. He then walks away, confidently stating that Jesse won't be able to keep him there for long. Meanwhile, Doug returns home and meets with the family doctor, who updates him on his wife's worsening condition and the immense pain she is enduring. Although Doug doesn't comprehend why she chooses to hold on, he believes there must be a reason. The doctor informs him that he will never know the reason because Doug's wife is completely unable to communicate. The next day, Powder is sitting alone in the dining room when Donald approaches him. The professor reveals that he felt a distinct energy within himself when he touched Powder during the earlier incident in class. He describes the energy as immensely powerful, making him feel youthful again. He also talks about Einstein's theory, which states that if a person uses 100% of their brain, they can do unimaginable things. Perhaps Powder is able to do just that, which explains his incredible powers. Donald then expresses his desire to be friends with Powder so that he can gain more information from him. The scared boy is a bit hesitant at first, but he eventually agrees. On the other hand, Doug visits Duncan's place and notices that he has removed all firearms from his home, despite being a diehard fan of hunting. When asked about the reason, Duncan becomes emotional and shares his experience of feeling the deer's pain when Powder transferred it to him. He describes it as an extremely distressing sensation, as if he himself was on the verge of death. Duncan admits that he has been so traumatized by the event that he can no longer bear to hold a gun. Hearing all this, Doug realizes that Powder has extraordinary abilities, and this gives him an idea. He decides to take the boy's help in communicating with his terminally ill wife using telepathy. Later, Doe brings Powder to his home and introduces him to his ailing wife, Emma. Gently touching her forehead, Powder delves into her mind, relaying her thoughts to the sheriff. Through Powder's telepathic connection, Doug learns that his wife is holding on to life because she doesn't want to pass away without wearing her wedding ring and without reconciling with their estranged son, Steve. She reminds Doug of a cherished memory from Steve's childhood when they played together in the snow and she lost her wedding ring. Hearing this, Doug recollects how Steve used to come home from school every day and searched through the snow in hopes of finding his mother's wedding ring. Emma then reveals that Steve has already found the ring, and it has been kept in a silver box on her nightstand all this time. Moved by the revelation, Doug is filled with a flood of emotions, and he tenderly places the ring on his wife's finger. Powder then touches Doug's wrist with his other hand, allowing him to hear his wife's voice. Overwhelmed, Doug breaks down in tears, embracing his wife and assuring her that everything will be all right. In her final moments, she opens her eyes one last time before peacefully passing away. Shortly after, Steve arrives on the scene and Doug immediately hugs him tightly. The two then finally put their differences aside and reconcile after years of being apart, all thanks to Powder. The scene then shifts to a county fair, where Powder meets Lindsay. It appears that she is the only one who doesn't treat him differently. After a bit of chatting, Powder suddenly touches Lindsay's hands, enabling them to hear each other's inner thoughts. During their exchange, Lindsay learns that Powder's father abandoned him due to his albinism. Feeling bad, she offers him comfort and reassures him that his face is the most beautiful one in the world. She then abruptly kisses him, catching the attention of the nearby people. Unfortunately, Lindsay's father also notices the act, prompting him to confront Powder and subject him to hurtful insults. He also prepares to beat up the poor boy, but luckily Jessie, who is also at the fair, intervenes. She apologizes on Powder's behalf and takes him away. Later, a heartbroken Powder returns to the hostel and gathers his belongings, with the intention of escaping back to his farm. However, as he is leaving, he overhears some boys playing basketball. Curious, he walks to the court, only to discover that it's John and his gang. Powder doesn't want anything to do with them, so he tries to leave. But the bully John obstructs his path and takes his hat. He then dares Powder to use his power and take it back. Our protagonist can easily do that, but instead, he delves into John's mind and reveals his painful past of being abused by his stepfather. It becomes evident that John's stepfather had once seized the hat, which had belonged to his late biological father, and subjected him to the same taunting that he is currently inflicting on Powder. Unfortunately, this only enrages John even more, and he decides to take action. Suddenly, rain begins to pour, and John forcibly drags Powder outside. He humiliates the poor boy by stripping him naked and pushing him into the muddy water to add color to his pale skin. Unable to endure any further humiliation, Powder unleashes a powerful electromagnetic pulse in a spherical shape, sending all the bullies flying. After a brief moment, everyone regains their composure, except for John. Concerned, Mitch checks on him and discovers that his heart has stopped beating. He is actually on the verge of death. Realizing what he has done, Powder is filled with instant regret, so he quickly springs into action and starts administering CPR on the bully using his powers. Fortunately, the procedure works and John is resuscitated back to life. This impresses all the bullies, especially Mitch, and so he decides to help him out. He assists Powder in secretly boarding a vehicle that is heading towards his grandfather's farm, allowing him to escape without further trouble. Unfortunately, when Powder arrives home, he discovers that all his belongings have been seized by the bank. Shortly after, Jessie comes to him, offering solace and assuring him that she will find a better place where he will be accepted and understood, unlike now. Donald joins them as well, and as they prepare to leave, they encounter Doug and Duncan outside. Jessie requests Doug for his support, urging him to let the boy go. Surprisingly, the officer agrees, as Powder has helped him reconcile with his long-lost son. At that moment, a thunderstorm erupts, and Powder starts running into the field with everyone trailing behind. Suddenly, a lightning bolt strikes him, eventually engulfing him in a blinding flash of light. The movie concludes as the clouds unleash one last resounding thunderous roar, indicating that Powder has reached the heavens. Plod subscribe to Chanel to get notifications and like the video.